It is great to welcome you to Stonehill Community Church. It always is, and I never take it for granted that you would give time on a Sunday morning and part of your weekend to come and be a part of what we do here. The chapter in the installment of the story, in fact, if you were here at the top of the hour, right around 10 or so, some of you maybe guessed today, or maybe you've not been a part of the series. What you saw at the beginning was a review or rewind video, and it kind of starts from the very beginning and brings you up to where we are. And I hope I've done a good job of explaining most of those high points in there. And I really appreciate you from the bottom of my heart for staying with this larger narrative, this meta-narrative of the Scriptures. And it's not just a story, it's the story of the world as it centers in Jesus. And so I want to thank you for staying with this series. We're going to wrap it up in August, so you just stay with it a couple more months. Keep journeying through, doing the small groups, story groups and things. God's going to grow you through it. And He has already. I know He has, and I can see it in some of your lives. And so thank you for being a part of this. And our installment this morning is chapter 24, and it's on the front of your bulletin, No Ordinary Man. No ordinary man. Now, you're looking at an ordinary man this morning. I'm very ordinary. In case you didn't already know that, I am very ordinary. I worry sometimes. I don't maybe treat my spouse the way I should. Maybe I make parental mistakes or pastoral mistakes. Sometimes I'm preaching and I don't make the points I should have made. And sometimes I'll spend all day Sunday going back and replaying everything I just talked about, and I just think, man, I missed my opportunity. I had that set up perfect, and I blew it. And so I'm always kind of just replaying that. I'm kind of like a sheep, and I need a shepherd sometimes. And Psalm 23, I even need Psalm 23 sometimes. And, really, we live in a very tumultuous time, don't we? There's lots of things to get upset about, lots of things to be worried about. Lots of things we've got flooding in West Virginia, people crawling on top of rooftops to try to survive, and up in trees and things. Flash flooding's very common there, but maybe not on this large of scale. But you've got people being killed in Orlando. You've got places in the world and on the international stage, Britain, other places where there's threatening revolt. And who knows what will happen here when we survey the political landscape of the United States of America. There's just a need for peace. There's a need for sanctuary. There's a need to be able to walk into a place of serenity, a place of peace. Sometimes that is geographical, and sometimes that is spiritual, but regardless of what it may or may not be, you need peace this morning, and I need peace. We all need it. And it's wonderful that the Scriptures give us that peace, and Jesus Himself give us a sense of peace, and we need peace. One of the things that I'm kind of relearning and discovering is, and I never really wondered why, or never could figure out why. I live just not too far from here, maybe a mile and a half, 2 miles, and we just have a backyard with a swing in it, and a few pine trees, and some green grass and a blue sky, okay? And I never really knew why Megan always said that's one of my favorite places in all the world. And I mean, it is in the middle of a cornfield, and so there's a clump of trees, and so right at the edge of daybreak, you hear all the birds coming to life. And then right at dawn, or at dusk, at sunset, you hear all the birds coming back to roost. And it's like a little mini sanctuary in all the corn. And all the soybeans, I guess. Sometimes they rotate the crops. But it's just like a little sanctuary. And I never really understood that. It's like, Megan, I could think of like 100 million other places in the world to be besides our backyard. I mean, come on. It's just a little rinky-dink yard. It's not that big and things. But now that I've lived a little bit, and I've kind of I miss her some, and I'm kind of wanting to feel what that's like to be with her, and to kind of know what she loves and to be where she loves. And so I've spent a little time reading in my swing and things in the yard, and I just I've begun to rediscover, or maybe discover for the first time, why that little backyard means so much to her. She lives now in a very asphalt jungle by comparison. And so there's parks and things there in Kansas City, but it's not nearly the way the rural life here of Northeast Indiana. And we need places like that. You need places like that. We don't have to spend a lot of money. You don't have to go a lot of miles. But you can find, some people call it your happy place, or the place where you can sense God and feel His presence and know His grace and sense His peace. And I want Stone Seal Community Church to be that kind of place for you. But you have to understand, I'm an ordinary man. There's only so much I can do, but what I can do, I will purpose to do for the glory of God. And one of the things I've learned early in ministry, when life gets chaotic, when there's unpredictable landscapes, when you worry about things and you're lonely maybe at some times and you're missing people and things like that, there's a place of quiet rest in all of that. And I can, and I know, I've lived long enough to tell you, that the person in whom the rest centers is no ordinary man. He was prophesied about in the Old Testament. He made certain pre-incarnational appearances in the Old Testament. The angel of the Lord, the special phrase is used to present Christ appearing in a visionary form. He wasn't incarnated at that time, but He appears human in the Old Testament. He's prophesied about. The history of Israel moves along. Eventually, those prophecies come fulfilled. He is born to a virgin, and he grows up. He has a supernatural birth narratives that surround his life. He grows up. At 12 years of age, he is in the temple, certainly aware of God's special chosenness over his life and anointing over his life. And then for 18 years, he's growing and learning as a human being. He's coming into his prophetic role and his messianic office. And then at 30, he launches a ministry. He teaches things nobody ever taught. He performed miracles nobody else could do in the way and the scale that he could do it. He raised people from the dead. He created sanctuary, places of social sanctuary and peace for the outcast, for the marginalized, for the brushed aside. And his culminating capstone miracle was on Easter Sunday. He came storming out of the grave, forever a conqueror over death, hell, and the grave. 40 days later, he ascends to heaven, where he currently intercedes for you and for me. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is no ordinary man. He's extraordinary. And one of the, I know we've had a lot of tragedy and things, but one of the greatest tragedies is that individuals would live an entire lifetime and never seriously consider the claims of this superordinary man. That's the greatest tragedy of all. It's a tragedy to lose people we love. It's a tragedy that a life cannot be lived to its full measure, and maybe random violence cuts a life short. Those are tragic things, and we're not downplaying those. But I think even a greater tragedy is to have an entire lifetime and never at one point in that life ever seriously consider the claims of the superordinary man we know as Jesus, Yeshua, the Son of God, the Savior of the world. And no matter how ordinary I am, no matter my addictions and my problems and my worries and my frets and my fears and my ordinariness, He invites me in to find peace in Him and hope in Him. And I want you to make sure you understand that's the message of my life. Is I can't do life without Him. I can't preach without Him. I can't husband without Him. I can't parent without Him. I can't family without Him. I can't neighbor without Him. He's everything. He defines the story of my life, the story of the world, the story of the cosmos, the story of the universe and the multiverse, and the story of life and time and dimension, of feelings and emotions and love, of happiness and hope and joy. He defines it. He redefines it. He shows us how to live it to the full. And He invites you in. He's no ordinary man. He's super ordinary. We're ordinary. But there is no greater hope. There is no greater joy than to encounter this super ordinary person and to find in Him the peace and serenity that He provides. Now, when we think about the great tragedies of life, we think about people who never seriously consider the claims of Jesus, of this super ordinary person. That is a great tragedy. And perhaps another great tragedy is those who do consider His claims walk away and they never become a fully devoted follower of Jesus. They might toy with the idea of Jesus. They might like Jesus a little bit, but fully devote themselves to following Him? No, I don't think I'm going to go that far. And I think it's another great tragedy of life, to not follow Jesus as a fully devoted follower. And I think that sometimes, like I said, we're sheep. I'm a sheep sometimes, and I get sidetracked, and you get sidetracked, and we need a shepherd to bring us home. We need the one who can create peace, these little sanctuaries of His presence that can see us through life and all the chaotic upheaval of life and the chaotic messes of life. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at just one of many, there's like 36 miracles that Jesus performs that are recorded. There was a lot more than that probably, but 36 of them find their way in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we're going to look at the capstone miracle outside of the resurrection of Jesus. The capstone miracle of all the miracles that He performed. And the reason I say that is because there's only 2 miracles that are found in all 4 Gospels. And when I say Gospels, I mean the first 4 books of the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are synoptic. In other words, they're very similar. John stands apart as somewhat separate, more theological, plows in deeper maybe than the others, but they all tell a very similar story. They are not just biographies of Jesus, they are Gospels of Jesus. They tell us a little bit about Jesus, but more about what He said and what He did for the world. And so we're going to look at the feeding of the 5,000 plus. And it's a capstone miracle. It comes at the end of Jesus' Galilean ministry. And so he's endeavoring to say something here, and we'll set this up. Slide number 3, if you would. Slide number 3 for me. You're going to see the 4 places in the Gospels where this capstone miracle occurs. Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 44 is our text, and the story pages are 335 through 351. And according to Matthew's account of this great feeding of the 5,000 plus, King Herod Antipas had heard about Jesus and was investigating Him. And so by sailing to the eastern side of the lake, he left Herod Antipas' jurisdiction, and he was going to the rural part, the hill district. Now I want you to look at something with me. If you would, go to slide number 15 for me. Slide number 15. King Herod the Great, the guy that tried to kill Jesus when he was a baby, he had 3 sons. His family's a mess. We won't go there. He had 3 sons. Archelaus was one of them. Archelaus inherited this part of the land of Israel. Here's the Dead Sea. Here's the Sea of Galilee right there. And Archelaus ruled this area. Herod Antipas ruled the Galilee, and he ruled east side of the Jordan. And this is his territory right there. Herod Philip ruled this area here. These are 3 sons of King Herod. And what you have to keep in mind is that Herod Antipas, this guy right here, had John the Baptist executed about right there in one of his fortresses. And John the Baptist was a preacher of the word, and King Herod Antipas, tetrarch, could not handle it, and one of his family members performs a lewd dance, and he uses it as a means to celebrate that and a means to grant her or to request of her whatever she would want. He would give it to her, and she requested, at the prompting of her mother, the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And that's exactly what happened. And when that word gets out, that's what happens. All of these followers of John who are hanging around here, who have to go bury the body of their headless hero, they get upset, they're disgruntled, and they headway up into Galilee, and they get up into this area here because they don't want in Herod Antipas's territory, and so they kind of gather right at the edge of it in the Herod Philip's area. This is where our story happens. The feeding of the 5,000 happens right at the edge of that. Things were getting hot in the Antipas Empire. Okay? And so Jesus, I've got a lot I have to do yet. It's not my time. So he and the disciples, after a very aggressive ministry campaign, they head into that area right there, out of this guy's jurisdiction. Because, like I said, Herod Antipas is not very favorable toward John the Baptist, of course. And he's thinking now that Jesus is a kind of a reincarnation of John the Baptist. So he's very intrigued. Jesus understands that. And so in all this chaotic mess, Jesus takes his disciples to a very isolated place. A place where they can renew, re-energize. A place where they can be safe. A place where they can accomplish the next part of their ministry. And what happens here in this capstone miracle is, in fact, the culminating miracle that closes out a Galilean ministry. After this miracle, Jesus heads south into Judea, into the Archelaus area, and he begins to pour his life into these 12 disciples. His public ministry on a broad scale closes down. He still has a public ministry, but it's not as broad. The crowds aren't as great as they were in Galilee. And they thin out a little down here in Judea. I think my laser pointer is going to blink. But so this is a very important thing that we look at, a miracle from the life of Jesus that we look at here, and it's very, very strategic. And so when Jesus went to this part of right at the edge of Galilee, in the region of Herod Philip, and if we go to slides number 12, 13, and 14, 12, 13, and 14, you can kind of see Capernaum is where they were hanging out. Go to the next slide for me. You see Capernaum. And then you see Bethsaida up and to the right, Sea of Galilee. That is where the feeding of the 5,000 plus happens. And if you walk that, it could be 6 to 8 miles. If you get in a boat and sail across the tip of the eastern tip or the north tip of the Sea of Galilee, it'd take you about 4 or 5 miles. All right. So if it's a good day for sailing and rowing, you could get there in a hurry. And if you wanted to try to get to Bethsaida from Capernaum ahead of someone in a boat, you're going to have to really move. You're going to have to really move. Hoof it. It's about could be up to 7-8 mile run. And so, and the reason I say that is because it sets up our story for today. And again, we're dealing with a group of people who they head to the hill country and the wilderness places in and around Bethsaida and in the reign of Herod Philip, his region. They head in this area because this is where your rebels hung out. This is where your guerrilla guys, your zealots, hung out. This is where they congregated and tried to realign and tried to figure out, what are we going to do? Our hero is gone. Let's head up to this place. That's where everybody else is hanging out. John the Baptist is gone. They head north. Jesus and this large crowd of people, Jesus and disciples, they intersect right here. Right at that juncture. Right at the end of his ministry. Right at the end of the John the Baptist life. But right at the beginning of something great. And so on slide number 14, it gives you another kind of a multi-dimensional look at this. You can have an idea. There's Bethsaida, there's Capernaum, and that's kind of how the lay of the land lays out there. And so Jesus is on his way to this hotbed of revolutionary resistance to Roman imperial rule. Again, it's where the freedom fighters would hang out. And it was a very unpopulated region. Slide number 6, if you would. Matthew tells us there were 5,000 men. Luke tells us there were 5,000 men. Mark tells us there were 5,000 men. Matthew also tells us besides women and children. And so we know that this is a crowd that stretches between 10 to 20,000 maybe, and maybe even beyond that. It's a huge crowd in a barren place filled with disgruntled, aggravated, fearful, rebellious, freedom-fighting, anxious, angry group of people, with a lot of personal needs on top of that. And so John, in his gospel account of this incident, in John chapter 6, verse 15, he comes right out and says that what Mark kind of hints at, and the other gospel writers kind of hint at, they all gathered, and what does John tell us in John 6:15? You can check it out. They came to make Jesus king by force. That's what they're going to do. We're tired of our people dying and the bad guys winning. Let's go up here in Bethsaida. Let's rally the troops. Let's get us a leader and let's go take care of business. They want a revolution. And the death of John the Baptist has them all fired up. And so there is a crowd. I mean, and the reason the men are noted, I think particularly, someone's counting heads. These are fighters. Now Matthew gives us a little parenthetical thought. Women and children were present, but we had 5,000 men strong. Let's rally the troops, let's distribute the weapons, and let's go do this. And Jesus essentially says, and they're all chaotic. You know the emotions, you know the fear, you know the aggravation, you know the anger you would feel if I hope you'd be mad if someone decapitated me, it's a gruesome thought, but I hope you'd be mad and want to do something, right? But wait a second, you can't cut our pastor's head off like that. We're going to rise up and resist, and I would hope you would do that. So they're just being human. They're being ordinary. We're ordinary. And Jesus says, boys, I'm not going to, in so many words, I'm not going to avenge the death of John the Baptist. It's not right, but I'm not going to avenge it. I'm going to do one thing here, one big thing, that will tell you what I want you to do until God takes care of business, not us. And the feeding of the 5,000 is an answer by the Savior of how He wants you to live when the host empire is going ape. When you live as an exile, and really we saw in the early video, we're still exiles in a lot of ways. And I said that a few weeks ago. These are the guys on the fringes. These are the guerrilla guys. These are the guys that are ticked. And they're on the fringes, and the revolution is stirring. And Jesus says, you need peace, boys. And we have, in all of the miracles, perhaps one of the greatest miracles of peace. It's a pastoral scene. And what I mean by that, it's peaceful. And we'll get into that in just a second. And so from now on, as I've said earlier, after this miracle, post-miracle, Jesus heads south. He shuts down the Galilean ministry. He starts doing things on a smaller scale. He pours and invests His life and time into these 12 who are going to continue His message and His legacy. And so let's work through the story, and then we'll see maybe some applications here at the end of this thing. But on slide number 4, what we see, the apostles gathered around Jesus, slide 4, and reported to him all they had done and taught. And they're pumped up, but they're tired. And ministry takes a lot out of a person. And then because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat. So they're tired. They've engaged in spiritual warfare. They're emotionally spent. Their leader is gone. He's had his head chopped off. But some of the, at least some of the people that in the crowd were feeling this way. And so the apostles were feeling this way as well. And they come, he says, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. That's what you need. And so they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place, from Capernaum to Bethsaida, about a 4-mile boat trip. But many who saw them leaving recognized them, and they ran on foot. The word ran is suntreko. It's a Greek word that means to run along with or to rush with. So this is the first 8-mile run in the Bible. It's a 12K right here. The Galilean 12K. You run from Capernaum to Bethsaida. It's about 8 miles. If you're quick enough, you can beat Jesus and his team there who's going by boat. So they had a little trail running here in the first century. And so they ran on foot from all the towns, and they got there ahead of them. They beat the guys in the boat. And on a calm day, it had been hard to do. But if it was a little choppy, it would take them a little more extra time. Maybe they had that to their favor. But as we see in a little bit, it was a calmer day. It was a beautiful day. In fact, it was so pretty that thousands could sit on a hillside and not get wet. So we can see the blue sky. All right, you're going to see green grass in a minute. You're going to see the blue water in a minute. It's a beautiful pastoral scene. No matter how rough life is going for you today, no matter how difficult it is for you today, no matter how chaotic you feel, how fearful and afraid you feel, Jesus invites you to walk into a miracle. And you walked right by it when you came to church this morning. Green grass. Blue sky. I even noticed this morning, I highlighted my sermon notes in green. And I think I've been thinking about green and blue and the peace of that. That's the miracle. That in all this chaotic mess, God has given us a world where we can feel His peace and know His peace. And when Jesus is in the middle of all that, there is so much peace to be found. And so we're going to see it in just a second. But they come from all the towns. They get there ahead of them. When Jesus landed, He saw the large crowd, sweaty 12K runners. And He said, "Oh no, boys, they're still after us. Keep rowing. Go home, all you groupies and thrill seekers. There's no t-shirts or belt buckles or goo today for you." No, He didn't say that. But it is an interruption of what He had planned. And when He saw all those people trying to get to an out-of-the-way, secluded place, a barren place, Luke 9:11 says He was welcoming them, and He had compassion on them, Mark says in verse 34. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Sheep without a shepherd. They're tired, they're weary. A lot of disgruntled people in the group. But He saw them as sheep without a shepherd. And so what did He do? He began teaching them many things. What did He teach? Sermon on the Mount and other things. Revolutionaries ready to revolt, ready to go back and avenge the death of someone they loved. And Jesus, instead of passing out weapons, and there's a time for that, don't misunderstand. But this was not the time. And instead of passing out weapons, Jesus goes educational. And these guerrilla revolutionary leaders in remote rural parts of the Middle East, when their disciples come to them and they say, "Liberate us from oppression," they give out weapons and they start weapons training. But Jesus Christ gives out His word and bread, and He gives the disciples bread distribution training. This is how I want you revolutionaries to live when the host empire has gone ape. This is how I want you to live. This is what I want you to... This miracle and some of the components of a miracle is what is an agenda that Jesus wants them to give themselves to while we try to figure out what our next move is going to be. And so they are exiles living under a host empire, much like people today. And the reason why the commentators know that what Jesus is doing here, and it's a radical repudiation of the liberation models of the day, they all agree. What Jesus does here, they're ready to revolt, and Jesus teaches. And He does something wonderful. He didn't always go around censoring the host empire and telling everybody how bad Herod was and how horrible it was to be under the subjection of these kinds of crazy, idiotic leaders. But what He does do, He starts His own movement. And it's a beautiful thing. And this is one of the miracles, I think, that helps fuel this new movement. Verse 35, slide number 5. By this time it was late in the day, after 3 p.m. Jewish time. And so His disciples came to Him, and in unison, when everybody comes to you and they're all together on it, it seems like it gives a little more believability and convincibility. And they all say together, "This is a remote place." You don't say. They state the obvious. And it's already very late. Send the people away, verse 36, so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. When you run like they ran, they get hungry and agitated, and food was a big issue in these days. There's no Taco Bells or Chick-fil-A's to prepare it for you, and you have to find a place to prepare it as well. And so He answered, verse 37, "You give them something to eat." And they said to Him, these weary, tired apostles, "That would take more than half a year's wages." There's not enough money in our accounts to buy that much food for this many people. And are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? I detect a little sarcasm from the apostles. Verse 38, "How many loaves do you have?" He asked. "Go and see." And they start inventorying who has food. And in John's account, John 6, 8 and 9, one of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to Him, "There's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. What are these for so many people?" And so some anonymous kid, I take it, has a bag lunch. Bless his little heart. Bless his mama's heart, who sent him on an 8-mile run with a bag lunch in his hand. Something when you get to the other side of wherever you're going. 5 loaves and 2 fish. And so, when I'm a little kid and I'm going through this story, maybe it's the same for you. When I picture 5 loaves, I'm a hillbilly bread kind of guy. They're about that long. You can get them at Kroger's or wherever. Hillbilly bread, 5 loaves of that. That'd feed, that's a pretty good sized lunch for not just one little lad, but maybe 15, 20, 25 people. If you have 5 loaves of hillbilly bread, you'd be set. It's really good. And, a little peanut butter and jelly on there, and you're good to go. And so I'm thinking, this is actually quite a bit, but it's not the same as we think of when we think of a loaf. It's interesting because the word that's used for loaves is really a word that's used for biscuit, or we could, in their particular culture and context, we could think a thick cracker. Think of a really thick Ritz cracker, and you just about got what a loaf will look like. And how big it was. 5 thick crackers they found, and 2 pickled fish about the size of a sardine. 5 crackers and 2 pickled fish, sardine-sized fish. And it's true, when that little guy put those little pickled fish in between those crackers, he had a little feast, I'm sure. He was preparing to have a little feast. And the text says when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Now picture it. 5 Ritz crackers, 2 sardines, and upwards of 20,000 people. Picture that. It's crazy. And I'm thinking, did the kid give it up willingly? Did he give it up willingly when they're looking, inventorying who's got food? What I think of is the little chicken in the farmyard who's running with one piece of bread, and all the other chickens want it too. Have you ever witnessed that here in Indiana? I have. It's a comical scene. One time Megan had a friend at West Noble, and he had a cookie that some dude wanted. And this guy started chasing him for his cookie, and just as he caught him, was going to take his cookie, he crammed the whole thing in his mouth and just crumpled it up, chewed it up. Well, maybe, I don't know how much of a struggle there was or how all that went down. And maybe there was a chase. I don't know. But they come up with 5 Ritz crackers, thick Ritz crackers, and 2 pickled fish. Verse 39, then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups. And all the men are thinking, oh boy, here's where I get my sword. Here's where we get the weapons, guys. We're not sure about what's going to happen with the food deal. Maybe we'll go a different direction there. But Jesus directs them to have all the people sit down in groups. On the green grass. Only Mark tells us what color the grass is. Is he stating the obvious? Well, in a country prone to drought, that's a pretty important detail. And maybe Mark is trying to create a picture for you to appreciate. Maybe in their uptight state of mind, maybe in the revolutionary mindset that's just devastating them with worry and fear. Maybe this talk of a shepherd in verse 34, the green grass now in verse 39, I kind of think he's got Psalm 23 in mind. And Psalm 23:2 says, green pastures and still waters, there's the Sea of Galilee. And this is one of the most evocative pictures in all of poetry. Green grass, green pastures, and still waters with a loving shepherd. Green grass, blue skies, all reflected in the still waters of the Sea of Galilee. You're walking into not just a miracle, but into an aesthetic delight. I love colors. I love blue and green. They're my favorite colors together. Grass and sky. Green, according to color theorists, is the color of spring. It's new life. It's calmness. And many times it's associated with health. The color green is understood to be the most restful, relaxing color for the human eye to view. It brings us closer to nature. It creates a soothing environment. I even have a green John Deere trucker hat, and I've never owned one thing by John Deere. But I like that hat. I like to wear that hat. It's green. It makes me feel good for some reason. Blue. Blue. It produces a calming effect for mind and body. It invokes rest. It can cause the body to produce chemicals that are calming and exude feelings of tranquility. In fact, if you're decorating a child's room, according to color theorists, I strongly suggest a shade of blue. Shade of blue. This is such a peaceful scene in all the chaos around them. And they sit down in groups of hundreds and 50s on green grass. Now picture it. You've got the reds and blues and yellows and the earth tones of a typical Middle Eastern wardrobe. Thousands of people clumped up in groups against the backdrop, hundreds and 50s against the backdrop of green, all over the mountainside, a sky of blue, a water of blue. It would have resembled flower beds in a garden, all on the mountainside in a rural place. Mark, the author, relishes the beauty of the scene. He relishes it. And notice now how the narrative slows down and zooms in on precisely what Jesus did in verse 41. I want you to note the 4 verbs, because this is the skeletal structure of a Jesus kind of revolution. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, from whom all blessings flow. Verse 41, He gave thanks, He blesses it, And he broke the loaves, and then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. And I know he had a smile on his face when he did it. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. And they carefully watched. Notice how the narrative slows down and focuses on his body language and his hands, what he's doing with his hands and what he's doing, where he's looking, and they slow it down because there's no way that a guy can have that many crackers and fish fit up his sleeve to feed this many people. They really watch him. He did this, and he did this, and he did this, and he did that, and he just kept doing it. Just kept doing it. And they all ate and were satisfied. Verse 42. And the other gospel accounts let us know that everyone got their fill. It's not exactly the Messianic banquet they were maybe hoping for, but it was a sufficient miracle for the sufficiency of the needed, meeting the need of the hour to help them to continue on their journey. So if a boy ate 5 crackers and 2 fish, did an adult eat 10 crackers and 4 fish? You do the math. 25,000 times all of that, upwards of 25,000 people maybe. You've got thousands of cracker biscuits broken up and scattered, and thousands of pickled fish just coming out of his hands, just like that. He satisfied the multitude with the staples of a peasant's diet. And he sanctioned that a great meal shared with others is a good thing sometimes. Otherwise, why not just create it in their stomachs? Put it in their stomach and save them the bother having to chew and swallow. Nope. Jesus doesn't do it that way. That's not a Jesus kind of revolution. A Jesus kind of revolution, they needed to be grouped up. They needed to be circled up in 50s and 100s. They needed each other. We need each other sometimes when the host empire is going ape. You need each other sometimes. Churches need each other. Communities need each other. We need to create these communities where good things can happen despite what's happening in our world on a larger scale. We have to have some blues and some greens. We've got to have these simple things. Therapy is good, but nature with Jesus can beat it any day of the week in my book. Therapy is good, but when we have Jesus and the blues and greens that He's created, oh, thank you, Lord, for the peace. Well, verse 43, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. It's kind of amazing. Jesus created just enough for each of them to have their own little basket or lunch for the next day. And the number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. See, do you want to revolt? Do you want to change the world? Are you struggling with what to do in life in the face of tragedy? I think Jesus is showing them what He wants them to do, what He wants you to do, what He wants me to do. And they hinge on those 4 verbs in Mark 6:41. Take, bless, break, and give. That's it. That's a Jesus kind of revolution. You know, later in Mark's Gospel, Mark 14:22, Jesus is at the Lord's Supper the night before He's about to die. And it says, take, eat, take this. This is my body. He blessed and He broke it. This miracle in Mark 6 is pointing to that. Jesus is saying to everybody who's coming after Him, those who are going to try to make Him king, He wants them to engage in 2 great revolutionary acts that you and I can do in places of blue, with backdrops of green and shimmering blue, by still waters. Bless people and be broken for them. You want to start a revolution in Ligonier? Bless people and be broken for them. After explaining what the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus meant, Jesus himself was walking with two guys. This is a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus in Luke 24. Again, I'm focusing on those 4 verbs, those 4 actions, those 4 revolutionary things that Jesus holds out in the front of all the revolutionaries who had other ideas. And as they approached, slide number 7 if you would, as they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going to go further, but they urged him strongly, "You're not going anywhere. Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them, and when he was at the table with them, he took bread, he gave thanks, he broke it, and he began to give it to them, and their eyes were opened. Sound familiar? He did that at feeding 5,000. He did it again feeding 4,000. He did it the night he was just about to be arrested and eventually crucified. And now, after he's resurrected, he does it again. And that's how they know him. Took bread, gave thanks, broke, gave. 4 great application points for would-be revolutionaries in a day when everything seems uncertain, redefined, and up for grabs. And you know what's crazy? We're not done. Slide number 8, 1 Corinthians 11:23. This is Paul writing to the Corinthians. "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he said," implied he gives, "This is my body which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." 4 verbs. Take, bless, break, give. Say it with me. Take, bless, break, give. The same sequence. See, Christ takes what you have to bring to him, flaws and all, in his hands. It becomes blessed and broken, and then and only then is it ready to be distributed to the hungry. And what we bring to Christ is changed in his hands such that what is given away is far better. And it's only when you're broken that you can feed the souls of men. And when it says do this, you can't pick between the verbs. Well, I'll take, but I'm not blessing them. Well, I'll bless, but I'm not going to be broken for them. Well, I'll be broken for them, but don't expect me to bless them and don't expect me to give. You can't pick between the verbs. It's a rhythmic pattern of life here. It's the communal, rhythmic, sacramental pattern of life. That life will never work right until we live the sacramental pattern of Jesus. Take. Well, he won't take unless we offer. Bless. And if we offer our lives, he blesses. Break. Without fail, there has to be a breaking in life. There has to be. If you remain a whole loaf, you'll never be good for anybody. It's only when you're broken into pieces that you are fit to be ministry in the world. Give. When you are broken and totally relying on the Lord, he will give you a way. This is the sacred rhythm of life. It's the revolutionary kingdom agenda of Jesus. He who lived an extraordinary life. He who creates this beautiful pastoral scene. It's like the greatest unmiracle of the Bible. It's not fancy. It's not like, look at that mountain, I'm going to have it explode in front of you. That kind of miracle. He never did that anyway. But it's not this sensational kind of stuff. It's just the basics of life. It's bread and pickled, it's crackers and pickled fish multiplying in scenes of green with backdrops of blue and a shiny blue water close by. And Jesus says, with that and this 4-verb rhythm of life, this is how a world is changed. And this is how you are to respond to a host empire that's going ape. A world that's going crazy. You see, the Galilean question was, what can we do about the Roman occupation of our land? What should our role be? And what about the great act of injustice toward John the Baptist? You know, we need a deliverer, a king, a Messiah, and we need him now. And you have the same questions today. What about Hillary Clinton? What about Donald Trump? What about those who establish agenda for the world? Those who are the trendsetters, supposedly, of the world. And we see this. And so many times, revolutions typically start with a shot. People storm the fortress, or they pull the trigger, or they shoot the arrow. And that's when the revolution starts. They start typically with acts of violence. But when they gathered in 100s and 50s, and instead of a weapon, they got a piece of bread. Instead of a battle cry, they got a pickled fish. And they got so much of it that they got their full. And Jesus says, I want you boys to pay attention to what I'm doing here today. I'm turning the revolutionary ideas on its head. And it's only if you're willing to offer your life, bless the lives of those around you, be broken for them, and give yourself away. That's the only way you're going to have the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want moments in life. That's the only way. And you see, just quickly here, Jesus shows us that exiles in a host empire practice hospitality. That's important in days like these. It's important that we circle up with friends and neighbors at tables or on decks, in yards or parks, and break bread together. It's important, Jesus shows us, that exiles practice generosity. And I love this because Jesus, He fed the thrill seekers. He fed the entitlement people. He fed the sexually immoral person. He fed the bad attitude people in that crowd. He fed the revolutionary awaiting his weapon in that crowd. He fed the addicted in that crowd. Everyone. He did not discriminate. He did not discriminate on who would receive His grace and who would not. No one had to fill out an application to see the sunset that evening. No one had to fill out an application to sit on the green grass. No one had to fill out an application or qualify for the delicious meal. No one had to pass a test to appreciate the blue sky. Jesus didn't ask for character references before people could eat. He didn't evaluate their motives. He took the best and the worst of them and acted as a good shepherd over every one of them. He healed everybody. He fed everybody. He taught everybody. And see, that's the kind of generosity that the new revolutionaries of today's era have to demonstrate. The host empire is not a generous empire. It's filled with all kinds of political agenda and ideas. But it's the beauty of those who understand hospitality, it's the beauty of those who understand generosity that stand to create a revolution. We see also how Mark positions his material, gives us insight into what may be asked of us sometimes, and John the Baptist is an illustration of that. Scholars have noted that Mark likes to create a Markan sandwich, or bookends. He'll start to tell you something, he'll deviate to interject something different, and he comes back to what he just started to tell you. It's a Markan sandwich. It's Markan bookends. Very unique in his gospel. And so he does that here in Mark chapter 6. He starts to tell us about the great ministry enterprise of the apostles. Then he interjects this block of material about John the Baptist. And then he comes back to the apostles and what happens here on a green hillside in Bethsaida of the blue sky. And on slide number 9, we see it. Slide 9, finally the opportune time came. Verse 21, okay, quickly here. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. When the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, you've seen this. Okay, verse 23, he promised her with an oath, whatever you ask, I will give you up to half my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask for? The head of John the Baptist. She answered, verse 25, at once the girl hurried in to the king with the request, I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The king was greatly distressed because of his oaths and his dinner guests. He did not want to refuse her, so he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. And the man went, beheaded John in the prison, and brought back his head on a platter. He presented it to the girl. She gave it to her mother. And on hearing this, John's disciples came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. Now do you see why they were ready for revolution? Have you ever had to bury the body of your leader, the headless body of your leader? You see, the Markan sandwich here is meant to show you something. All of John's followers had retreated to Galilee, and many of them were in the crowd here that was fed. And instead of going violent, Jesus presents to them a new way to revolt. Take, bless. Offer your life. Be broken. Give. And then I think what we see that exiles who understand this great act of spiritual worship, they also understand that exiles have to practice stewardship. Notice they never wasted any of the food. You know, by contrast, when I look at the Herodian supper and the feeding of the 5,000 plus, in one meal you have a half-nude dancer lewdly presenting in body language form a message that her father had to celebrate, and he celebrated that. His inebriated guests are around that table. It's a grotesque platter. It's a formal dining room palace. It's being preoccupied by social etiquette. And contrasted with that kind of a meal, you've got green grass, blue skies, a picnic lunch with people that I love and people that they were growing to love, who aren't looking to exploit in some way, but who are willing to talk about the things of life that really matter. That's the kind of meal I want. Just give me Jesus. Just give me a peasant's lunch. Give me a trail to run on, and people who love me, and people who live in the nooks and crannies of the host empire, who have resolved to let all of life be a reflection of the relationship with God and of the story. These are the life changers. These are the revolutionaries. The meal scenes contrasted in the Markan sandwich is striking. And I'll take the Jesus kind of simplistic meal over the Herodian feast any day. And here's where it gets hard though, guys. Is Jesus asks us to love the Herodian crowd too. And sometimes to be broken over them. You know, a final thought today as we wrap this. And I understand there's some of you that are going through a very chaotic place. And you need a sanctuary, and I hope you can step into this miracle this morning and find His peace. I hope you can see the sky is bluer and the grass is greener and the water's purer, and that you can just feel and know His presence in all of that. But I understand that maybe there's a special portion of His grace you need. And I want to give you an opportunity to receive that today. But I want to do that with this conclusion. And that is that Jesus models for us the great sacramental life pattern of all true revolutionaries. He models for us what it means to take or to offer our life, to bless others with our life, to be broken for others, and to give ourselves away. That 4-verb pattern. He does it all. And if you see Jesus blessing and breaking on the cross for you as your substitute, it's going to make you a revolutionary. How? If you see a loaf of bread and it stays whole, I can't eat it. You can't eat it. We starve. We die. We decay. We literally go to pieces. But if the bread stays whole, I go to pieces. And if I am to be whole and eat the bread, Jesus said, if you take and eat, this is my body, He says. And what He's saying is, this is my body. It has to be broken into pieces. There's no other way. It's me or the bread. Either your pieces or I go to pieces. And Jesus said, I'm the bread. And what He means by this is, I was torn to pieces so you could be whole. And I went to the cross and I took the penalty the human race deserved for all that you've done. I absorbed the sin and I absorbed the punishment and I absorbed the judgment. And if I had stayed whole, you would not be, you would have been broken to pieces. But I was broken to pieces so you would be whole. And since we're all into colors this morning, red. It's the color of fire and blood. It's associated with energy and war and danger and strength and power and determination. Slide number 16, if you would. Slide number 16. Red is the color of fire and blood. Danger and strength and power. Desire and love. And since we're talking about colors this morning, Mark sees red blood against the backdrop of all that green grass and blue sky, for by the time you reach the end of his story, the Savior is spilling out red all over the place. Red is an intense color. It enhances human metabolism. It increases the respiration rate and raises blood pressure. I began today by saying the great tragedy of life is to live an entire lifetime and never seriously consider the red that was shed by the most extraordinary human being, God-man, that has ever lived. To say no to His act of love. To walk away and choose to be anything other than a fully devoted follower is to shortchange the breaking and spilling out of the life that He lived. I don't have a weapon for you this morning. There are ways and times and places where weapons are needed and we've got to confront the rebel. I understand that and I'm pro for that in every way, and you understand that about me. But when it comes to the ordinariness of everyday living, of green grass and blue sky and water and just living our life from day to day, that is not the answer. That's not the answer. The answer is to be broken and spilled out. And in the strangeness of all of that, we find a good shepherd who's with us. He throws in some blues and greens. And the greatest color of all, the color red. He says, here it is. My life for yours. I'll go to pieces so you don't have to. Play a closing song if you would for me.